Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Tanner's Favorite Things. I'm Tanner Knight, and today we are going to continue with the guitars in the Gregg Collection with this ESP George Lynch GLK-1 Kamikaze. GL standing for George Lynch, K for Kamikaze, 1 being the very first signature model. So that's the nomenclature of this guitar, GLK-1 Kamikaze. So if you watch the teaser to the Gregg Collection, you'll recognize that I ended with this guitar because I do think it's probably the most important George Lynch guitar that exists as far as model, and especially this one being 1987. Based on some information that I found, this serial number actually does have some year codation built into it. I believe the 1 stands for November, as in like 11, and the 3 is the 3rd day of November, and the last two, 8-7, are 1987. So a really, really early version of the George Lynch GLK-1 Kamikaze. I believe it's maybe one of 10 from this era. It's really difficult to find information on this because there are so few, but these stamped fretboard ones are very, very rare. Now, this information is 20 plus years old, 25 plus years old, so it could be wrong. Let me know if you have any more secure information that debunks that kind of dating of the serial number. Again, there's not too many of these out there with that stamped serial number, and sometimes you'll even see them stamped on this fret instead of on the very bottom past the 22nd fret, so between the 21st and the 22nd, but this one's on the very last piece of wood after the 22nd fret. Really early first year George Lynch signature guitar from ESP. So I wanted to do this one first because it was the first signature guitar that ESP offered of an American artist, which is pretty monumental in its own right if you think about ESP and the guitarists who are famous for playing ESP guitars. Kirk Hammett, James Hetfield from Metallica, Ian Scott from Anthrax. All of these metal guys really gravitated towards the ESP guitars in the 80s. George Lynch of Dokken and later on the Lynch Mob. He is one of them, and he's pretty much regarded as being one of the best guitar players on earth. And I think that that is kind of how he got in the door at ESP, just being such a badass player. So before we get into the history of this specific guitar, let's just do a little bit of history of George Lynch and his signature guitars previous to this, which are none, really. He had an affiliation with the Japanese brand Aria, which, I don't know, a lot of people kind of aren't really familiar with Aria. They're just an overlooked brand, one of the Japanese, not copycat brands, but just one of those brands where they started it off making Fender and Gibson replicas, and the lawsuit era of the 70s kind of forced them into making their own models in Japan. Not in the Japanese markets, but if they exported a guitar, it had to be unique. So George Lynch worked with Aria early on for a very brief period of time. I don't think he actually had a signature guitar. He just maybe played Aria guitars for a little bit. But he also flirted with Kramer, another brand that we've heard quite a bit about in the Gregg series. He talked to them about having a signature model as well, but it just never came together. And in fact, Kramer, the people at Kramer, seem to be pretty key to the whole ESP connection with George Lynch, because he found George Lynch, that is, found an ESP neck in some store, just the neck, not a guitar. He found the neck and he loved it. And he brought it to Kramer and he said, "Can you guys produce this neck for me? Can you make this?" And they said, "You're going to Japan on tour here in a couple of years. Why don't you just go to the ESP factory and have them do it themselves?" And I think there's a lot of reasoning behind that. Kramer actually went to ESP in the mid-80s themselves to have all of their bodies and necks made. So there was probably a little bit of a relationship to begin with, but Kramer pushes George Lynch towards ESP, and he goes to Japan while he's on tour and talks to the guys at ESP, and they're just super excited to have someone of the caliber of George Lynch in their offices talking guitars. So they nerd out for a couple hours and come up with this. So I'll address kind of the small elephant in the room, or large elephant depending on who you are and where you live, but this guitar gets a lot of heat for being culturally insensitive. We're not going to make that the focus of this video. I'm just going to mention it and share my 2 cents on it. But the whole idea of kamikaze pilots and bombs being dropped is pretty insensitive to the Japanese public at large. and ESP is a Japanese company, so it's a little baffling as to how they came to this conclusion that they wanted kamikaze pilots. And well, this guy's a kamikaze pilot, and some writing and all of the stenciled graphics here. They come off as a little insensitive in 2024, but you have to remember this was the 80s. I don't want to give that a whole excuse because it's still not, but people's sensibility was different in that era, and this wasn't seen as an insult or an insulting type of graphic back then. Tides have turned, and you can see a lot of people who are not too psyched on the graphics. But that aside, it is a guitar, and if you can just close your eyes and pretend that it's natural wood or whatever, it still plays like a guitar, and that's the good news here. I'm gonna have a hard time playing this one specifically because we do have all 4 members of Dokken represented here in signatures, and I think this one here is actually George Lynch's signature, so I don't want to rub that one off. That one's the most important. I'll play it a little bit, being kind of, you know, a little precious with it, but I'll link to a few videos of people playing these for real, as well as George Lynch himself. I'll see if I can snag a snippet, maybe, we'll see. But either way, this is a really, really important guitar in the history of ESP and metal guitars in general, because this is really what inspired Kirk Hammett and Ian Scott and those guys a little later on in the later 80s to pick up ESP and make it their own guitar as well. But we do get a single coil in the neck here, and apparently he used the single coil quite a bit on glassier stuff. Anytime he needed to get out of the lead channel in whatever amp he was in, you know, the single coil becomes a much better option at that point. But this Zebra Seymour Duncan here is a super distortion, I believe. I think they change it up a little bit kind of in the ensuing years, but it should be a super distortion and just hot wound. The one thing that you'll automatically notice when you pick up a George Lynch guitar is that it's heavy. This is a heavy guitar. It's not the heaviest guitar I've ever picked up, but it is a maple body with a full, I'd say 2-inch thickness on the body, almost Les Paul thickness. And no routs in the back. Well, I guess we have the Floyd Rose route here, but as far as routs go, he wanted minimal routs to have as much heft and as much meat on the bone of this maple body as possible. To complement that, we do have a maple neck bolted on to this maple body with a nice streaky ebony fretboard. And this might look like rosewood to you upon first blush, and I guess you wouldn't be faulted for thinking that, but it is in fact ebony, just one of the streakier varieties of ebony with, I believe they're acrylic inlays, but they're very nice as well on the dots. This particular model has the matching painted headstock. I'm pretty sure all of the Kamikaze models do get a painted headstock, but that's not always the case for George Lynch signature guitars, as we'll find out in the next one. On the back, we do have our Made in Japan insignia right there, so you know it's real. This is a custom shop guitar, ESP custom shop out of Japan, so it's not just like an ESP that you could go pick off the shelf like an M1. This is a fully custom built guitar, and it's made by their highest luthiers on the team. Little attentions to detail as far as designs go. This input jack is very unique. It's like a Strat slanted style, but it's on the actual end here, so kind of cool. It gets the cable to protrude out this way and theoretically puts less strain on the cable. Nice little detail there. And true for all kind of ESP signature guitars, even in the custom shop, these are not hand painted. They are decals that they put on here. So every single one of these guitars should look identical. It's not like you have small variations from airbrushing or stenciling or something like that. These are just decals that they throw on here, and you know, that's a very unique ESP flavor of the era, and something that kind of caught on a little bit, but then it's one that ESP is really only known for. You see the Kirk Hammett guitars, especially from his cinematic collection, like the Mummy and Frankenstein and stuff like that. Those are all decals, and they should be identical from one guitar to the next. We do have 22 jumbo frets here. Not anything too special there, just 22 frets. And our neck this is really where the George Lynch signature comes into effect. This is a skinny, wide neck. He employs a 16 degree, a really, really flat fretboard radius. For reference, Fender uses anywhere from 7.5 to 9, maybe up to 12 degrees on their Stratocasters, and that's kind of considered the standard, like a 10 to 12 nowadays, whereas 14, 16 degrees, we're talking about shredder style necks. And that's exactly what this is. George Lynch can move his fingers in ridiculous ways. He has big hands too. You would think that they would not move as quickly as they do, but he's the man. He knows what he's up to. And yeah, George Lynch can shred. We do have a regular German, not a licensed Floyd Rose. This is a full-on German Floyd Rose. It does have ESP branding on it, but George Lynch wants the real deal, just like Eddie Van Halen when he needed a tremolo that would keep his strings in tune. This is the model that they all gravitated towards. Of course, with the Floyd Rose, we do get the locking nut, which this one, so here's kind of the downside to the George Lynch guitars. Being a little bit wider at the nut, this Floyd Rose nut is not long enough to cover up all of the wood, and there's actually a little bit of just overhang from the nut to the actual fretboard on both sides. It doesn't affect playability whatsoever, but that's just telling you that this is a much wider nut width than most guitars that Floyd Rose was speccing at the time. The George Lynch guitars employ a 6-string string tree here, so all strings go under that tree and keep our headstock nice and flat. No tilt back whatsoever. Just nice and straight. This is a one-piece maple neck. No scarf joint, nothing funky going on there, no 3-piece. Just one nice piece of hard maple. Our 4-bolt design is slightly offset to give George access to those upper frets on the tenor side, so that's slightly carved away, but it's not too dramatic. Otherwise, this is what I would consider a Strat shape, a general Strat shape. It's much blockier than a Strat, but when you hold a Strat up next to it, you can definitely see the inspiration. We have the higher upper bout here and the smaller lower bout. This is just a little more angular. Everything's a bit more aggressive to match the metal sensibilities of the time. It's not very often that you see a dual pickup guitar, even if it is a humbucker and a single coil, with a single volume knob. There's no tone, there's not a second volume knob, it's just one knob to rule them all, and this one happens to be a push-pull button. So you have what I assume is some sort of splitting or tapping of these coils in the humbucker. And maybe it affects the single coil as well, not entirely sure, but that's one of those things that George wanted. A little bit of fancy electronics, but in the simplest form possible. We get 6 Goto individual tuners, kind of the small style, but just in line there on the banana style headstock. You'll also hear this style of headstock referred to as the hockey stick style, for obvious reasons, but it's very ESP in design and very similar to Kramer and a lot of these other shredder axes of the time. So I personally am not crazy about signatures on a guitar, especially if they're just in Sharpie, because you see Sharpie as this permanent marker, but when it's on a poly finish like this, it's not permanent. It's basically being written on a whiteboard style of surface. So if you smudge it really well, you can just take these signatures off in one fell swoop. You could put some overspray on top of them to just put a layer of protection, but that I find devalues the guitar just based on the fact that you're messing with the finish. So it's kind of a lose-lose in my book. If you really, really love the artist, and this one particularly, having a George Lynch signature guitar with a George Lynch signature is pretty cool. I gotta say it's pretty cool, but still it doesn't necessarily raise the value in my mind. I'm just one guy. I'd love to know what you think about signatures on guitar. Let me know if you have any guitars with signatures, and if you play them, or if you avoid them, or if it makes you feel any differently about the guitar than if there's no signature on it. As far as condition goes, I would say that this is about as good of condition for a 1989 guitar that I've ever seen. There are 0 real major issues that I can see. Again, there's some fingerprints just because you don't want to rub this thing too hard in case you get near the signatures. but there's no huge nicks or dings. I'd say it's looking about a 9 out of 10 if I had to say anything. And I can't really find anything specifically to devalue it to that 9 versus a straight 10, but I find that guitars this old, they have to have something that is there whether you can see it or not. And maybe the most egregious thing is in the neck pocket here. There's just a little bit of something, a crack in the finish or something. It doesn't go into the wood, and it's just really tiny, but that's probably the most egregious thing on this guitar. So if you can live with that, I'd say that you've got a winner. Speaking of, this guitar is for sale. So if you are interested in a really, really early version of the George Lynch Kamikaze guitar, I'd say get your hands on this one, because you will not find a cleaner one with the provenance of the signatures on the guitar. I haven't played this one yet. Again, I'm a little afraid to, but just take a look at the distance between the strings and the pickup. These things are right on top of those coils, maybe a millimeter or two in between. So I have a feeling that this thing is just gonna scream when plugged in. So I'll go ahead and plug it into the 5150 for a little bit. We'll get a few sounds, and then I'll try to find some other videos of people really shredding on one of these so that you can understand what it sounds like in the real world. Okay, Greg had this one tuned to D standard, so we're just gonna roll with that instead of tuning up a whole step. So we're in D standard, just know that might be why it sounds a little bit lower than normal. So I kind of misspoke earlier about the push-pull. It's actually the switch to switch between pickups, and I didn't actually realize that there wasn't a way to switch pickups before that. So without a pickup selector, this is your pickup selector now. So when it's pushed in, that's your humbucker. When it's pulled out, that's your single coil. So we'll go through both of them, but first, here's the humbucker wide open. And you'll see how just absolutely massive it is based on how high it is compared to these strings. That's loud. That's loud as hell. In fact, I should have my earplugs in. Okay, here's that single coil. Man, the super distortion pickup, it wants to break up, but it's just pushing the ceiling a little bit higher in the cleans without being in an actual lead channel. So speaking of lead channel, we are playing through the PV5150 today. This is my favorite metal amp, so what better combination than a George Lynch guitar with a 5150. That amp is being plugged into this PPC 2x12 orange cabinet with two Celestion creamback speakers with the Sennheiser E906 microphone on the left speaker. So again, Lynch is known for playing cleans every now and again, but when he's playing, he's generally ripping through a 120 watt amp. Okay, that's about as much as I feel comfortable playing this guitar. It's a little nerve-wracking holding something so valuable in your hands. Even though I'm taking extra precautions to do it safely, it's still a little nerve-wracking. But in any event, this is a very, very rare and special guitar. So I think if you are a George Lynch fan, this is the one that you want first. The fact that this one was spec'd with a single coil that's accessible via the push-pull little switch there, I think is a really nice option. It basically doubles the amount of tones that you get in one guitar, and it's one of those balance issues once again. I love having the simplicity of just one pickup, but if you can have a little extra versatility without really breaking the bank with space or just confusability of being able to play the thing, then why not? So instead of playing this guitar any further and risking marring these signatures, I'm going to put it back in the case very nicely and link you to some videos below and share a few snippets from those videos just of a few people actually shredding on the ESP Kamikaze custom shop guitar. So one final tidbit that I'd like to pass along with this guitar is that it and the one that we're going to see in the next video, the Purple or Sunburst Tiger, belong to the largest ESP George Lynch collection in the world. This picture right here shows you this exact guitar in the collection before it was purchased by Gregg, along with the Purple Tiger here. So both of these guitars were part of this George Lynch collection, and Gregg was lucky enough to snag both of these before they were separated into other people's collections. Does that add value to this guitar? I'd say probably not, other than knowing another little bit of provenance about where this guitar has been the last 30 years or so. And it was part of that really prestigious, largest ESP collection in the world, and it fit right in with all of those beauties. So there you have it. The ESP George Lynch GLK-1 Kamikaze. George Lynch's very first signature guitar with ESP, and ESP's very first American artist signature guitar ever. So that was very, very prestigious, and this really birthed a lot of future relationships between metal guitarists and ESP. So let me know if you have any questions or experience with George Lynch guitars, and if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them as best I can. Might have to get Greg to answer specific ones, but either way, let me know what you think. Let's have a conversation in the comments below. Also, like and subscribe. That always helps keeping this channel in front of you as best as possible, and you can see all of this cool gear that I present semi-regularly. So let me know what you think, and I will see you on the next one.